Welcome all yet to another exciting group session on strategic planning and project planning and management. As you remember, last time we talked on project concept development and project cycle. This time around, we're going to dive deeper and look into the tools that are used in order to guide project planning and also guide the evaluation of a project. So we are going to look into theory of change as a tool and also project evaluation. All right. Firstly, let's take a look at theory of change. What is theory of change? Basically, a theory of change is a tool that explicitly articulates the assumptions that underlie your plan to achieve a specific goal and lays out a method to test these specific goals. It is generally represented in the form of cause and effect diagram. A well-designed theory of change allows you to clearly communicate what your activities are and why they lead to the outcomes that you and your supporters want. So from this statement, you can see that a theory of change is somehow a best laid plan or kind of like a roadmap for you to succeed in your project implementation. For more details, please look into the link below from Charity Entrepreneurship, where they explain more on the specifics of theory of change. Now, before we go into the nuances of theory of change, let's step back a little bit and think through why it is important for us to create a theory of change tool. Well, I have come up with three basic importances of a theory of change tool to project planning. The first one being it helps organizations to know when their project is a success. Remember, a theory of change is composed of key goal areas in which a project sets out to achieve. Therefore, these goal areas would guide whether the project has been successful or not when the project has been completed. That's the first one. The second one is that a theory of change helps you to deduce your logical framework. Remember, in our first session, in line with strategic planning, we talked about project concept development and we also talked about a theory of change. We also talked about the logical framework, where we talked about inputs, outputs, outcomes, key midterm goals, and key long-term goals. And we also talked about indicators of success. So for you to come up with um, details of your logical framework, you need a theory of change tool to guide those key steps or sections in the logical framework. And from our last group session, we all know why a logical framework is important. The third one is that organizations stay on the critical path when they have a theory of change in place. Why is it so? Remember again, a theory of change is composed of key goal areas in which a program sets out to achieve, both in the short term and in the long term. And these key goals interconnect to each other to ensure that there is a cause and effect phenomenon. Therefore, it leads that each and every activity that are laid out into your critical path or your critical plan are set out that they must contribute towards an overall goals specified in the theory of change framework. Now, let's take a look at how best can we be able to frame a theory of change framework. There are about four components which you have to think of when coming up with a theory of change. Firstly, you have to think of the activities which you are going to do. These also align with the inputs which you're going to use for you to achieve those activities. And then key outputs after you have, implemented those activities, and then the intermediate outcomes, and then overall long-term goals. The biggest key thing that you have to ensure when framing these four components is that each and every component has to feed into the next component. What do I mean? Remember, in the beginning, we talked about cause and effect. So each and every activity or each and every factor within one component should cause an effect into the other line item or the other section. This is very important because it ensures that you are able to know that your overall goal at the end is going to be met by all these other intermediary goals, these key outputs, and all these key activities. That's where I think staying on the critical path becomes a sole importance of the theory of change, because each and every activity would lead towards a certain key output, and those key outputs will lead towards a certain key outcome, and those key outcomes will lead to an overall long-term goal. Once you see that an activity or key outputs are not interlinked with the next line item of goals, intermediate goals or overall goals, then you would know that that line activity or that key output is not contributing to your overall goal. Then you must be able to change it so much that it can be interlinked, or it might be removed and replaced by something else that is more suitable. That's the key thing when formulating a theory of change tool. Another thing which I think is most notable when trying to look into the four components of a theory of change is the differences between outputs and immediate outcomes. How different are they? Firstly, outputs, you must consider them as immediate, notable things that one could notice once an activity has been implemented. Usually it counts what exactly has happened. So it's mostly in the form of numbers. For example, if I'm implementing an animal welfare training targeting students in secondary schools, then key outputs could be the number of students that have been trained, the number of trainings that have been administered, etc. While when we take a look at key outcomes, these define the certain change that has happened when an activity has been implemented. Let's take the same scenario of trainings targeting school children. A key outcome can be, for example, the change in knowledge which the students have experienced, or the increase in knowledge in which the students have experienced. That could be a key outcome. Or maybe to rephrase it, a key outcome can be the perception change of students towards animal welfare issues. That is what we call key outcomes. Always dwell on what change has happened once an activity has been implemented. I hope you have noticed the difference. Now that we know how to frame theory of change, let's take a look at a practical example of a theory of change tool by animal charity evaluators. You would see that the four components are highlighted in this diagrammatic theory of change framework. Firstly, you have inputs and key activities elaborated here through charity as the inputs, and then interventions as activities that the organization is going to do. Now, after that, you have immediate outcomes, and then midterm outcomes, and then a long-term goal. So in line with the immediate outcomes, you have stronger animal advocacy movement, increased availability of animal-free products, and increased prevalence of anti-species values. All these are first-line immediate key outcomes after all the interventions have been done. And these would feed into two key midterm goals, which are improvement of welfare standards, and then decreased consumption of animal products. And in the longer term, you would see that the goal area is change for animals as a long-term overall goal. So you would see that there's always a cause and effect phenomenon that is happening in between each and every step of this theory of change. Something else that you might also notice is that in this theory of change, they haven't really given in key outputs. They have only given in key outcomes which have been, highlighted in first line outcomes and then midterm outcomes and then overall long-term goal. Now, let's cross over to project monitoring and evaluation. Maybe let's ask ourselves one question. Why have we jumped all the way from theory of change to project monitoring and evaluation? Hmm. You would see that a theory of change looks at goals, intermediate goals, key outcomes in certain aspects, outputs, and activities. Therefore, if these are set out to actually inform project implementation, then it means that when evaluating projects, you would have to consider the things that are set out in your theory of change and logical framework as well. That's the reason why we are currently jumping from theory of change to project monitoring and evaluation. Let me take a few moments to actually describe the steps that happen in a project monitoring and evaluation plan. When considering these steps, you have to ensure that you are well aware or well informed that project planning, monitoring, and evaluation is an ongoing activity. It goes cycles, in cycles, in cycles. You know. So once you know that, um, you will note that firstly, when we are doing project monitoring and evaluation, you firstly look at the monitoring aspect, and then after that, you evaluate your process of the project implementation, and also you evaluate your key outcomes, and then in the long term, you evaluate your impact. And all this data that has been collected is analyzed, and then recommendations are made, and then you start the process again through improving your project implementation, and the cycle begins again. So since monitoring is the first line of evaluating projects, let's talk a little bit about what monitoring involves. In monitoring, basically, when you look at your theory of change and your logical framework, there are indicators at each and every step of the way on the key activities that you are going to do. Therefore, you look at the key outputs which you set out that your activities are going to produce. Then you actually monitor whether these are being actualized or not throughout the project life cycle. That's what we call monitoring. In this table on this slide, things that you need to consider are theory of change and the logical framework itself, because these inform you um, on the key indicators of success. And then you monitor those if they are going to be met or not. And then we cross over to how you can be able to collect this information or this data, which you can analyze and see whether your outputs have been met or not. So you can do monitoring forms which staff would fill out, or the key target population of stakeholders will fill out, or the journals that staff keep, or the journals that each and every project participant would keep to actually track the key outputs which they wanted to set out, whether they have done it or not. And the type of data that you can collect from this would be either quantitative or qualitative. We will talk more about quantitative versus qualitative type of data in the next slides ahead. Next, let's see what process evaluation involves. As the name denotes, you are evaluating the effectiveness and efficiency of your process. So in this essence, you're looking at evaluating the systems which you have put in place in order to achieve the goals that you want to achieve. Are they effective systems? What can you be able to change in order to make the systems much more effective in the long run or in the next project cycle? So in this essence, you consider the stakeholders that are involved in the project and also the staff that are implementing the project. You would basically ask them whether the step-by-step processes that they use to conduct or to implement the project, you know, are giving out the results in an efficient way possible or in an effective way possible. Data that you can be able to collect in a process evaluation would include surveying the stakeholders or staff. You do focus group discussions, you do online on-site observations, and then things like activity log, whereby staff would actually log in uh, if they have done activities or not. You know, because for example, in the activity log, if fewer staff are logging in their activities and they are unable to finish their activities, for example, it means there's something wrong in the systems that are being put in place. Maybe they are not favorable for people to actually do the job that they need to do. So you need to change it. And in terms of like the type of data that you have to collect, I think it varies from quantitative to qualitative across the line in all these data collection tools. Thirdly, on outcome evaluation, the biggest thing to consider when doing an outcome evaluation is the stakeholders that are involved in the project, particularly the target beneficiaries of the project. You ask them how they feel the project has affected or has made an impact on their lives, for example. What meaningful changes have they seen, both negative or positive, for example? So that also depends on the key survey questions which you are asking them, or key questions which you're asking in the in line with focus group discussions, etc. Besides the consideration, the data collection tools that you can use in order to evaluate outcomes are surveys. These surveys are aimed at target beneficiaries. You also use key informant interviews, where you're not necessarily considering the key beneficiaries or target group of the project, but then you're considering other experts within that sector or that field that may have been indirectly involved in the project itself. So because they've got an expert opinion, they can be able to inform whether the project has been a success or not. And then you also have focus group discussions targeting the same stakeholders, or you actually physically go out to the project implementation area and do on-site observations, observing what people do. For example, have they, when you go out to visit these beneficiaries, maybe for example, if you are talking about their perception in line with animal welfare issues, are they slowly reducing meat consumption just because they are more concerned of animal welfare issues that you have trained them on, for example. So all these are areas in which you can gather data in line with outcome evaluation. The main goal is to actually evaluate what has changed significantly with the key implementing activities that you have implemented. And that informs whether a project immediately has given positive results or negative results. Again, the type of data which you can collect could be quantitative or qualitative, depending upon the type of questions which you have formulated and how you are collecting the data itself. we are going to, as I said, we are going to talk more about quantitative versus qualitative data and how best you can collect and analyze them in the slides to come. Lastly, let's take a look at impact evaluation. You should view impact evaluation the same way how you view outcome evaluation, because in a certain essence, all of them look at what changes have happened after certain activities have been implemented. Only that when looking at impact evaluation, you look at the long-term overall goal of your project. Have the changes you wanted uh, to take effect in the long term, have they been achieved or not? I think that's where how you view impact evaluation. Therefore, when you take a look at the project life cycle again, you look at impact evaluation as an end line uh, evaluation after the project has been implemented. While in the previous slide, when we were looking at key outcomes, you can look at uh, mid-term evaluation or first line evaluation, looking at different aspects of key project outcomes that are happening within the project's life cycle and evaluate them while the project is ongoing. While impact evaluation, you do it overall at the end of the project life cycle, so much so that you can be able to make final recommendations on how best whether to improve the project and then re-implement the project, or you can be able to make recommendations that maybe the project is not good enough to implement, therefore we can scrape it off and look into other projects that are more meaningful. Again, uh, factors to consider when doing impact evaluations are the key stakeholders. Key stakeholders would always be important because they are the first ones to be able to communicate how they have been affected by the project, either positively or negatively. Means of data collection tools, you can use surveys, you can use key informant interviews, focus group discussions, even on-site observations. One thing that is also highly important when collecting information or collecting data is the indicators of success which you specified in the logical framework in the beginning, because these key indicators of success also points out the means of verification or the means where you can verify whether these indicators of success have been met, and those would advise you on which data collection tool you can be able to use. Again, quantitative versus qualitative. During impact evaluation, you can collect quantitative data and qualitative data. Now, after collecting all this data, different source of data from different aspects of project evaluation, be it monitoring, be it process evaluation, be it outcome evaluation and impact evaluation. This data has to be analyzed and you have to interpret it so much so that people can be informed of what, meaningful interpretation that can have, so much that they can be able to make key decisions with regards to the projects which you are implementing. Now let's take a look at qualitative versus quantitative data sets. What are these and how they are different before we go to interpreting the data itself? Firstly, qualitative data. Qualitative data basically looks into information that is not in the form of numerical um, numerical data sets, information that maybe you might not necessarily count. These can be examples of these can be interviews, for example. So you record somebody on an interview, they've got their own perceptions, etc. This is mostly data that is qualitative. You cannot add one data set to another to make something else. When you look at qualitative data, you also look at this information as an example of data collection tool would be focus group discussions, where people are just talking about their perceptions to something. So obviously, you might not necessarily have information that is in numerical form. So basically, qualitative data is information that is not in numerical form, which you can do mathematical mathematical analysis to it. So basically, in qualitative data collection methods, what you have to think of is how you can be able to categorize this data so much so that it can be interpreted by people who are analyzing this data. So for example, if you have focus group discussions, after asking your key target personnels, you have to start categorizing the data into different buckets in order for that information to start making sense. And then after that, you have to assess the similarities and differences between the categories of data sets. And then you finally identify the level of occurrence of each and every category. Is it high? Is it medium? Is it low? Therefore, you can actually deduce whether a population which you have targeted in this evaluation, if it is if their perceptions are positive or if they are negative, or if their perceptions towards something is high, medium, or low. That's how you tend to qualitatively analyze data when generally looking at data analysis. As the name itself, quantitative, it means you can quantify and you can count the occurrence of certain things. Therefore, this type of data mostly deals with numbers or figures. There are two ways in which you can be able to analyze quantitative type of data. The first one is descriptive statistics, where you actually look at averages or means. You look at the frequency of how something occurs, for example, or you look at the percentage of something against something else, or you look at standard deviations, whereby how one thing deviates from the mean itself, both positive deviation or negative deviation. This is the most simple way on how you can analyze quantitative data and how you can also use that uh, type of analysis to actually make recommendations, the simple way. And then you also have inferential statistics, which basically look at predicting certain things based on the current sample data which you have used. And then there are so many other tools which you can use to make predictions about populations. This is more of a scientific way in which you can be able to analyze data in order to predict certain things or certain models, where after you have made a survey and you have come up with certain set of data, that data can help you to inform what can occur at a larger scale when you look at a bigger population. So basically in inferential statistics, sample sizes tend to predict what the overall population can be able to do, whether now or in future terms. So this is how you can be able to analyze quantitative type of data. Lastly, let's take a look at how people interpret the data which they have analyzed. Maybe before I jump into that, I think it's also important, stemming from the previous slide, that when analyzing data, you use various tools that you can use. You have, when we talk about quantitative type of data, you have tools or software that you can use. Once you have collected your data, you input into the software and the software analyzes it for you. So for example, if you want to do a descriptive statistic analysis, you can use SPSS, you can use Microsoft Excel, etc. There are so many of them. And the same way with inferential statistics. We're not going to dive into those details because I think it's a very broad topic on its own. Let's reflect back on, once you have analyzed the data, how best can you put it to good use? Firstly, you have to think of how the results relate to the key objectives and outcomes of the project. Remember, in the beginning, we had best laid plans that lead into key indicators of success, key outputs, key outcomes, and overall long-term goals. Now, when you have collected this data and when you have analyzed this data, how does this data relate to those key goals? Are they informing you that you have been able to successfully reach those key goals or key outcomes or key outputs or not? That's the first line in which you can be able to interpret data once you have seen it. The second one is to explain how and why the results are as is. So for example, if your key outcome was to actually change the perception of school children in line with reduced animal suffering through training them on animal welfare issues, have their perception changed? Have you seen an increase in the number of students who perceive as uh, issues to do with the animal cruelty as something which is a burden, and because of that, they have changed their ways in which they can be able to treat animals? Have you seen that change? How is it relating to your overall goals? Has it met that goal? You know, and if it has, why? Do you think the activities that were set out to be done are the activities that caused this or not? If not, then why did it happen that way? Why do you think these activities didn't lead to the outcome? So all those key questions, when you answer them, this is how you can explain how the results are as is based upon your key knowledge and key experiences. And lastly, you are supposed to give recommendations. So the results are like that. So what next? Are we going to improve our programming? Or are we going to change certain elements of the project? Or are we going to change the whole project altogether? What are we supposed to do basing upon those key findings which you have which you have seen? So this is how you tend to give and interpret uh, your results so much so that they can inform key decision makers on what to do in the next project cycle. From here, we have come to the close of our key lessons today. I hope you have had a blast absorbing all these key information. Remember, these are just summaries of information that has been deduced from very big articles. So you can follow the links in this slideshow, or you can follow the links in the group session guide, where you can have tons and tons of well explained information which you can learn from. Thank you so much.